Hello, this is Coach Wilson, and this is Unit 10, Day 1. Today we're going to be beginning our unit on World War II. And so we want to start off with our first journal on what problems from World War I could potentially still be a problem in the 1930s. List at least 4 problems. Now, you may have to go all the way back into your Unit 9 notes and go back through some of the things we talked about with World War I and with some of the problems that followed in the Great Depression, issues with Germany, etc. Now, we're also going to begin talking about some of those issues today. We're going to talk about the fuel for war. Okay, so what is fueling the war? Okay, today's essential question: what factors led to the rise of Hitler and the beginnings of World War II? Now, just to start off, we're going to start off with this Dr. Seuss cartoon, and it says, "Ho hum, when he's finished pecking down that last tree, he'll quite likely be tired." Now, obviously, this Dr. Seuss political cartoon is promoting what? And I'll give you a second to think. Hopefully, you came to the conclusion that this political cartoon has something to do with the United States not being involved in World War II. And essentially, if you look, you can see the buzzard has pecked down the last tree standing, which is England. And the only tree left is the one that is being sat on by the bird with the American hat on. I can't think of his name at the moment. And he represents America. And so the point of this is trying to get America involved in what's going on in Europe. And there was a lot of push for us to get involved in the early 1930s or mid to late 1930s on into, obviously, when we got involved in 1941. Now, different things going on in Europe and Asia that we need to note before we begin talking about the actual war. First of all, in Russia, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics had formed in 1922. That was under Vladimir Lenin. And then in 1926, led by Joseph Stalin, a massive effort to industrialize the country known as the 5 Years Plan shifted the USSR from a agricultural society to one of industry. And this idea was pretty much the basis of communism, and the focus to put factories and workers all loyal to a government that is, the factories controlled by the government, the products are controlled by the government, what you see, what you can do. And essentially, it's kind of like a dictatorship in the sense that, you know, there's a lot of absolute power, but it's controlled by the government, and everybody's equal. Everybody has the same things, and the government controls all of these things. Now, with this plan, there was no group that was allowed to oppose it, and it brought the deaths of 8 to 10 million peasants who resisted their policies, forming these gulag camps. And many of you've probably heard of a gulag before, but they're Russian prisons which were very hard to get out of. And they were work camps where they would put these people who resisted any of these communist policies. Now, communism, and I got a funny cartoon there for you, is a socio-economic structure and political ideology. In layman's terms, it's a political philosophy. If you want to write that out beside your notes, you can. Political philosophy. And it promotes the establishment of a classless, unbiased society based on common ownership and the control of the means of production by the government. So, in short, where we have what people would call a middle class, an upper class, lower middle class, low class, whatever you want to call it, okay, they don't have that. It's classless. There is no class society. Everybody has the same amount of money. Everybody has all the same things because the government controls all of that. Now, that's one side of the coin. We've got Russia, we've got communism, all that's growing. On the other side of that coin, we have Germany. And Germany, after the Treaty of Versailles, had created the Weimar Republic. Okay, Kaiser Wilhelm had been abdicated. Remember, the Kaiser was the guy who led Germany in World War I, was who everybody in America wanted to hate when we finally got involved in the war in Europe. Many Germans never actually accepted the Treaty of Versailles, and if you remember, there were a lot of things in it that weren't good for Germany. They blamed Germany for the war. They took a lot of the German land and basically broke it up into multiple countries. And the worst part of the treaty was that they'd given up land to create Poland and had to give land to France. So their basic arch enemy in this war was getting their land. And most of the propaganda focused on assuring Germans that the treaty was unfair. So what was actually being told to the German people was, in fact, that they were being cheated and that this was their fault. And this is kind of going to be the basis for why Hitler is able to rise politically, because he's one of the first politicians to come out and publicly denounce the treaty, and he gains a lot of push from the German people because they feel like they were treated poorly for, yes, they were involved in a war, but they backed someone else who got involved in a war. It wasn't like they specifically started the war. But Hitler's public denouncement of the treaty was called a stab in the back, and that's what he felt like. And honestly, there are some arguments to say that it was a stab in the back. Now, the bigger problem for Germany during this time, more so than the Treaty of Versailles, is the economic fallout that it created in their country. Not only did the Great Depression affect the United States in the 1920s and 30s, the Great Depression also affected Europe and many other countries. And, after World War I, the economic output fell 40%. No one knew how to run the machines in the factories that they had brought in. So, like, even if they brought in machinery, they didn't know how to use the machinery. They weren't trained on any of it. There was tons of shortages on food and raw materials because Germany's basically being shunned by the rest of the world. No one wants to trade with them. And to top it all off, the British and the French are blockading Germany and won't even allow America to send food to starving Germans. So essentially, it's kind of like holding a grudge against somebody who did you wrong. And yes, you got the best of them, but you're still aggravated about it. That's how Great Britain and France were treating the Germans. Germans ate dogs, crows, zoo animals, rodents, and some of the frontline troops during the war had even eaten horse meat. So things are bad for the German people during this time. Just to give you an idea, after World War I, they were forced to pay reparations of 132 billion marks, which is roughly about 31.5 billion by 1988. Finally paid it off in 2010. And they were, because they were paying reparations, this led to the inflation of German money, which means that their money went from being semi-valuable to not valuable at all. The inflation was so high, in fact, that their currency was worth 1/trillionth of its actual value. For example, $1 in American money equaled 4.2 trillion marks, and those prices doubled every 49 hours. By 1922, Germany's in default, and by 1923, they are completely broke. And who was to blame for accepting Germany's fate? Some blamed it on Kaiser Wilhelm, some blamed the new provisional government. Many people blamed the Jews and the communists and said that the Jews were at fault. Now, Hitler had fought for Germany during World War I, which if you watch the video that we talked about, or that we saw earlier in the semester, World Wars, it talked about Hitler, his involvement in the German military, how he found a place that, he could be a part of something greater than himself. And he harbored a lot of hatred for the Allies and the German government, who he felt like had, backed out on them during the war, that they should have kept fighting. He also saw a connection to Jewish moneylenders, that they had loaned the German government money and they were pacifist and they didn't get involved specifically. It's almost kind of the same way Americans viewed Native Americans during the Revolutionary War. If you go all the way back and think about how the Native Americans tried to stay neutral, but unfortunately it didn't work out for them. Now, Hitler formed the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or at least he joined it, and that's going to become kind of the basis of the Nazi Party. And their idea was they were sort of a working man's party, and he's going to use all of these things, from the Treaty of Versailles, the German government backing down and seeming weak. Also, he's going to hold, obviously, this hatred towards the Jews. There's a lot of things here that he's going to use to rise to power that people are going to get behind. Now, the National Socialist Workers' Party, they form. Adolf Hitler is one of their first recruits. Hey, like I said, he's kind of almost one of their founding members. And he's going to write this huge, I won't call it an expose, but his memoir called Mein Kampf, and calling for the unification of Germans, talks about the superiority of the Aryan race, basically blonde hair, blue eyed people, very anti Jewish, and also talks about expanding the German state. So you've got a ton of things here in this one document that he writes that a lot of people get behind, but it's also a very controversial document because it's calling for a lot of bad things if you really get kind of behind the basis of what he's asking people to do in Germany. Now, in regards to his timeline, he's focused on getting the Nazi Party elected to the Reichstag, which is German parliament. And many Germans voted Nazi during the Depression because the German government had done nothing for them. They weren't helping them in any way, and Hitler offered all of these beautiful, glorious things for Germans. By 1933, he's Chancellor of Germany. 1934, he's the President of Germany. And by 1935, he's rebuilding Germany's army. So you've got pretty much a very steep timetable of Hitler really growing his power and changing Germany. Now, just to talk about a couple key terms here. The first one being fascism. All right. Fascism is a radical nationalism. Now, we talked about nationalism all the way back in Unit 4 of American History 1. All right. It's a devotion to your nation. And Hitler's goal of pushing fascism was that you are alive to benefit the state, and you should dedicate yourself to country, and there should be nothing above it. In order to do this, he wanted to use a strong military to gain territory, and he's going to push an anti-socialist, anti-communistic government. All right, which is very funny because fascism in itself is sort of a socialist type government, at least in my mind it is. So, Nazism, that's the second term. It's a form of fascism. Among the key elements of Nazism are anti-parliamentarism and pan-Germanism. You don't need to understand that other than the fact to understand that it is very German-centric. Okay, that Germany is an elite race and that the people should support Germans and the growth of Germans. All right, it promotes racism, eugenics, which is euthanizing elderly, sick people, that you should try to stay as a healthy a society as possible and kill anybody that's not healthy. Anti-Semitism, anti-communism, and opposition to economic liberalism and political liberalism. Don't worry about those things. Like I said, worry about the parts that I have underlined there for you: racism, eugenics, anti-Semitism, and anti-communism. Now, Italy is also growing during this time. Obviously, Italy was an ally during the First World War, but now they're under the leadership of Benito Mussolini, and he is the head of the National Fascist Party. And the party rises in result of fascism growing in Germany and in Spain. And it has grown in Spain due to the Spanish Civil War under Francisco Franco. We're not going to get into that. We don't need to derail any further. But Mussolini ruled Italy as a dictator from 1930 to 1943. He formed his own secret police that destroyed any opposition, outlawed any type of labor strikes and people advocating for their rights. And by 1935, Italy has become a totalitarian state and is invading Ethiopia. So Italy is, they're putting down the gauntlet in 1935, years before we see Germany getting involved with the rest of Europe. The last group that we're going to talk about is Japan. And Japan had very few resources leading up to World War II, and they were relying heavily on imports during this time. And Japanese military leaders wanted to seize the territory of Manchuria in China. And Manchuria was kind of it was a territory, but it wasn't really an established country. It was being ruled by a prime minister, and that's not really important for you to note for American history. But in September of 1931, Japan's military invaded Manchuria and assassinated the prime minister. And the new prime minister during World War II, which was led by the military general Hideki Tojo, takes over. And he is not only the leader of Japan, but he's also the general of the Japanese Imperial Army. Now, there's still a prime minister there, or an emperor, I should say. There's still an emperor of Japan, but it is controlled by the military. They are the ones responsible for Pearl Harbor, and Hideki Tojo will be sentenced to death after World War II. Now, here are your vocabulary words. Make sure you get all three of these down: Mein Kampf, Nazism, and fascism. Please let me know if you have any questions, and I'll talk to you soon.